This panel was recorded Thursday, March 18th, 2021, as part of the Spring Eminent Scholar Lecture Series hosted by the Center for Public and Nonprofit Management at the School of Public Administration at UCF. Dr. Donald Moynihan presents.
So welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Deborah Carroll and I'm director of the Center for Public and Nonprofit Management, which is housed in the School of Public Administration at the University of Central Florida. And each year we bring notable scholars to our campus. This time it is, of course, virtually due to COVID, but we created the Eminent Scholar Lecture Series to bring notable scholars once in the fall and once in spring to our campus and deliver a lecture to our faculty, our students, community members, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we have Dr. Don Moynihan with us today for our Spring Eminent Scholar Lecture. Dr. Moynihan is the inaugural McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. His research examines how to improve how government works, and more specifically, he examines the behavioral effects of efforts to improve public sector outcomes through government reform, as well as the administrative burdens people encounter in their interactions with government. Dr. Moynihan has presented his research on public sector performance to policymakers at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, the World Bank, OECD, as well as many governments all around the world. His research has also been cited in President Obama's budget proposal, and he's also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Hill, as well as a variety of other venues. He's very active on Twitter and has quite a following if you've seen him on there. Prior to joining Georgetown University, Professor Moynihan previously served as director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he also serves as visiting professor at the University of Oxford and Aarhus University. He's past president of the Public Management Research Association and a member of the National Academy of Public Administration. Dr. Moynihan is also a native of Ireland and completed his Bachelor of Arts degree in Public Administration at the University of Limerick and his master's and PhD in Public Administration from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Today, for our Eminent Scholar Lecture, Dr. Moynihan will be speaking on behavioral public performance, how people make sense of government metrics. We also are going to be providing a PDF file in the chat for all attendees today, and this is a virtual book that Dr. Moynihan recently completed with some colleagues of his. So we only ask that you don't share the copy of the book with others or post it to social media because we don't want to get in trouble with the publisher, but Dr. Moynihan very much wanted everyone to have access to it today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Moynihan. Thank you so much, Dr. Moynihan, for being with us today.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a pleasure to join you today. It's sort of as I look out my window, a wet and rainy day in Washington, D.C. So I'm also sad I can't actually be down in Florida this week. But hopefully at some other point when the world is a little bit in a better situation, we'll be able to travel again. So it's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience and also to connect with new people as well. I'm planning to talk for about 35 or 40 minutes or so, and then leave time for questions. And so if you do have questions, please do just identify yourself so I have a name to attach to the question that you're going to ask. So I'm going to, of course, move to the inevitable screen share now for the PowerPoint presentation I'm going to present. So as Deborah said, I'm going to make this book available to anyone who wants it, a PDF of it. This is a book that just came out in the last year, and I spent a year in Oxford between Wisconsin and Georgetown, partly working on this book with a couple of co-authors, Oliver James, who's at the University of Exeter, Asmus Olsen, who is at the University of Copenhagen, and then Greg Van Ryzen, who is at Rutgers University. We have a shared interest in this idea that people use performance data in certain ways that are influenced by psychological factors. And we wanted to pull together a short, usable book that tried to explain how the behavioral aspect of performance information use really made a difference to how people interpreted and used performance information. And so I'm going to talk through some of the highlights from the book today. The book itself is really short. It's one of those sort of short books that Cambridge University Press is publishing. And so it should be sort of something that's easy to digest or even use in the classroom. But it tries to pull together a lot of our research and some other research on this particular topic. So I'll start by talking about the motivation for the book and then talk about some specific empirical findings we think this sort of subfield at the intersection of performance management and behavioral science has shown, which has to do with how people interpret information, the ways in which framing matters to those interpretations, the power of comparisons, the role of motivated political reasoning, how sources make a difference, and then finally, the role of autonomy and learning in the use of performance data. We are motivated the book by talking about two revolutions that we've seen occur over the last 20 odd years or so. I graduated as a PhD student in 2002, and I was asked to work on this topic of performance management as a graduate student, and then it sort of became my research identity for a very long period of time. And it coincided with a period of time where governments, for a variety of reasons, became quite interested in the power of using metrics to make decisions. And so aspects of this are tied to the new public management, also to government-wide requirements like the Government Performance and Results Act, and then its predecessor, the Government Performance and Results Act Modernization Act, as well as policy-specific guidance such as No Child Left Behind Act, which pushed public agencies to record what they were doing using performance metrics, make those metrics available with the ultimate idea that this would change how people made decisions and improve the quality of government. And so the crucial assumption there is that the data itself will be used by human beings to make better decisions. At the same time that this revolution is happening in government, there's also a revolution happening in behavioral science that's really pushing itself from the edges of psychology and into mainstream social science, most obviously in behavioral economics, but increasingly also in the area of public administration. And here a sort of central set of assumptions goes to the role that people's underlying cognitive biases have when it comes to processing information. A lot of this research is based on randomized experiments. And so most of the examples, pretty much all of the examples I'm going to present to you are either survey or field experiments that use to varying degrees actual public officials and performance data where we're asking them to make some sort of judgment or decision. The way in which we connect these two things is to look back at the history of public administration and note that Herbert Simon, the first Nobel Prize winner from public administration and arguably the first Nobel Prize winner from the field of behavioral science, was in the 1930s a graduate student who was collecting research about how local governments used performance data to make decisions. Before then, in the 1940s, writing administrative behavior, identifying the role of heuristics and bounded rationality in decision making, and really laying a lot of the groundwork for how we see today behavioral influences on decision making and judgment. In some ways, Simon's path that he laid out was a path not taken for public administration. Ultimately, it was taken more by psychology and behavioral economics, but has become, in the last 10 years or so, more central within the field of public administration under the guise of behavioral public administration. So our general set of assumptions here is that people's understanding, interpretation, decisions of performance data are going to be shaped by a couple of big factors. One is the nature of the data itself and how it's presented. One is the characteristics of the individual, what they bring to the table. And the third is the context in which they work. And in particular settings, those contexts can matter quite a bit in terms of the judgments people make. So what does this mean in practice then? So one starting point for our studies is the idea that people generally like the concept of using hard numbers or quantitative data to make decisions. And so my colleague Asmus Olsen has run this sort of series of studies on this point, where if you ask people, if you have to make a decision about the quality of schools, or if you have to get an operation at the hospital, what sort of information do you think would be helpful to you? And generally, people will sort of specify some sort of quantitative information. But what Asmus finds then, when he asks people to look at survey experiments and make judgments about the quality of public services, they tend to be more influenced by anecdotal information. So if you tell them a story about John's operation and how that went to the particular hospital, they're more likely to remember that information, find that information to be emotionally arousing, and have that information influence their judgments than if you give them a table of statistics about the quality of service for that hospital. So we think this partly reflects a social desirability bias. So people want to appear rational, want to believe that they're using information to make decisions. That's quantitative. But the reality is we're more hardwired to think about anecdotal stories. So one takeaway from this point for people who work in the field of practice is that if you want people to remember the point of performance data, you have to wrap that up in a narrative or story that people will find memorable. Otherwise, the numbers themselves will simply not be terribly engaging for people. And this is an example we pulled from New Zealand, where we sort of saw this as a positive example, the performance data that underlies the story, but they tie it to an individual's encounter with public services and talk about it through that person's eyes. A second insight is that we have some pretty obvious biases when it comes to just how we interpret information. And one big one is the left digit bias. So in general, we would like to assume that as rational actors, our evaluations of performance will be correlated with performance data. But in some cases, that's not true. In particular, we tend to pay lots of attention to the leftmost digit in the number and pay less attention to everything that follows that, and especially anything that follows a decimal point. We tend to discount that. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the results of an experiment where people were asked to judge the quality of a school, and they were given test score information. And what it shows you is people's evaluation of the school does not follow this sort of linear correlation between performance and actual outcomes. Instead, there's sort of a step relationship where if the scores are between 5 to 5.4 or 5.5 to 5.9, people don't really differentiate that in terms of level of performance. But if the difference is between 5.9 and just above 6, people pay a lot of attention to that and find that to be a different level of performance. So going from 5.9 to 6.1 is seen and perceived as a real improvement in performance, but going from 5.1 to 5.9 might not be perceived as a significant improvement. And so in some cases, the solution to this is to use graphical representations of information that we're also a little bit more hardwired to interpret easily than numerical representations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about frames now. And the idea of a frame is essentially it changes the way you interpret something. And there's a variety of different frames that we found to be relevant in how people process performance information. So the first of these is equivalence framing. The second is a negativity bias. And the third is ratios that people are presented with. So equivalence framing is the idea that if you give people the same information, but you present it in slightly different ways, they will respond to it differently. And one way that we've illustrated this point is if you give people performance data that's framed in sort of negative versus positive valences. And so, for example, if you're asking people to evaluate a hospital's performance and you tell them 90% of people are satisfied, so that's a positive frame, versus 10% are dissatisfied, that's a negative frame, it's the same underlying performance data that you're giving them, but people are more likely to evaluate the hospital as performing more poorly when you give them that negative frame, as illustrated in this graph. The reason is, once you start people to think about dissatisfaction, why are 10% of people dissatisfied? People focus on the reasons for failure, and they start thinking about the hospital from that perspective. And so they tend to evaluate the hospital in a much less positive way. A second sort of major finding from this field of studies, and this is a paper with Paul Nielsen and myself published in JPARP, is that people have a negativity bias in how they process performance data. So they pay much more attention to data that shows evidence of low performance. They're much more likely to punish data that suggests low performance than they are to reward good performance. And they're much more willing to attribute blame for low performance than credit for high performance. And so in this experiment, we asked policymakers to evaluate if school principals were personally responsible for outcomes in their jurisdiction. And what we find is they're much more willing to believe that the school principal has personal control over the quality of student outcomes if that data indicates that they're falling in the lowest third of the distribution. Another type of frame is the way in which we present the ratios of information. And so here we see something that's called denominator neglect. So if you change the numerator, but the denominator also changes, people don't really pay attention to the denominator. And so this is a study by Oliver James, where people are asked how safe they feel. They're given crime statistics. And what we find is people tend to start feel less and less safe when you start reducing when you start increasing, the denominator. And so if you tell people that crime is, incidence of violent crime occurs 4 times for every 1,000 inhabitants, people feel that is sort of a better situation and a safer situation than if you tell them it occurs 4,000 times per 1 million inhabitants, even though those are obviously equivalent types of information. So now I'm going to talk about the idea of comparisons as a motivating factor in how people make sense of performance information. And so again, the sort of fundamental point here that you can find going back to some of Simon's work is the idea that numbers don't speak for themselves. And to be meaningful to people, there has to be some sort of context in which they interpret the information. And so they need to have something that tells them if a particular type of numerical information represents good or bad performance. And there are a couple of basic types of comparisons we can make. We can look at how an organization did last year or the year before, so historical comparisons. We can compare it with a peer organization, a social comparison, or we can compare it to a pre-selected a goal or target that the organization has set for itself. And so a couple of findings here, we have some evidence that these peer comparisons or social comparisons tend to be more powerful for organizations, particularly if the peer is perceived as a salient peer, right? So if you tell, for example, Danish people about school performance in Denmark and where it ranks, they find it much more meaningful if they are compared to, say, their neighbors in Sweden than if you try to compare them to South Korea. We need peers that we find sort of relatable to weigh our level of performance against. There's also evidence in an experiment I did that if you show increasing and fairly high levels of performance, people are positive about that. But if you show the same level of performance as not matching a predetermined or pre-selected goal, people become more negative in judging the performance. So the underlying performance can be exactly the same, but if it doesn't match a goal or a target, people tend to rank it more negatively. We also see comparisons as being powerful in motivating people. So one field experiment I ran with Simon Kalmar Andersen in Denmark was to provide performance data to school principals across the country. They could go to a website that we had prepared, they could log in, download performance data about their school, so they were sent an email by us, and then we could observe how much data that they downloaded and whether they actually paid a lot of attention to the data or not. And so what we found was people were much more likely to download the data if the data was comparatively set up, right? If they could see how they were ranked against schools near them. They tended to download more data overall. They tended to spend much more time on the website. Some comparisons can make us come to perhaps faulty judgments. And so here, this is a specific type of comparison where anchoring effects take hold. And this is a comparison where we are given some measure of performance from the past, the anchor, and then we tend to judge present performance around that anchor, even if that anchor is not relevant or not. So the graph here is from an experiment that was undertaken by Nicola Bella in Italy, where they gave actual public personnel managers personnel files of a hypothetical individual, exactly the same files, told them, here's how this person performed in the last year. You have to rank them between 1 and 100. How would you rank them? And in some cases, they were told the person in the previous year had gotten 51 out of 100. In some cases, they were told they had gotten 88 out of 100. So even though they were told exactly the same information about the level of performance that they were supposed to evaluate, what they found was that if you were given the low anchor, people tended to rate you much more negatively. Your performance hadn't changed in the file, but that anchor of 51 out of 100 tended to make people more likely to evaluate you at sort of a lower level. And so you see that group got about 71 out of 100. The group that was given an 88 out of 100, or sorry, an 88 out of 100 in the previous year basically got the same results in the current year. So this is my favorite topic of the book, which is motivated reasoning, partly because it interacts with politics. It's a motivated reasoning as sort of a form of confirmation bias, where people select, interpret, and process information to fit with their pre-existing beliefs, and in particular, their political beliefs. And there's a bunch of really cool experiments that illustrates this. This first one comes from Oliver James and Greg Van Ryzen. They ran an experiment where they looked at people's processing and selection of performance data about the Affordable Care Act. And so this is obviously an act, also known as Obamacare, that's been highly politicized. Democrats and Republicans tend to have somewhat different views about it. So what Oliver and Greg did was to ask people to select data. They gave them sort of a suite of indicators to select data that they thought would be good information to evaluate the Affordable Care Act. In general, Republicans tended to select data that made the Affordable Care Act look like it was not performing well. In general, Democrats tended to do the opposite. They selected performance data that made the Affordable Care Act look good. So there's your example of motivated reasoning. Oliver and Greg also primed the subject of the study. So in one prime, they sort of asked them a question about their political identity at the start of the study. And what you see then is that really increases the gap in terms of the type of information that they selected, and also more generally how they evaluated the Affordable Care Act. But in another situation, they primed the subjects to think about their own healthcare needs. And so they asked the respondents to think about their personal health as they started to answer the questions. And when they primed them to think about their healthcare needs, those partisan differences really declined quite a bit. And so part of the lesson here is that priming that we're surrounded about all the time through the media that we consume really does matter to how we interpret performance data about public services. This is a study that Julian Christensen and I just published in the Journal of Behavioral Public Policy. And we were interested in taking this question of, we have lots of evidence about motivated reasoning on the part of members of the public. Do politicians behave in the same way? And so we set up a research design where people were told about two competing providers of public services, a public provider and a private provider. And we asked people about their political orientations. For the politicians, we also knew which parties they were a member of, so we could sort of infer if they were more conservative or more liberal. And then we gave them information about these two public providers, about their level of performance. There was a little bit of math involved, so you had to do some very simple calculations, but there was an objectively correct answer to the question that we posed for them, which is which provider actually performs best at providing the service based on the information we gave you. And so we can then track if people get the answer correct. We can then, as a result, sort of interpret how much their partisan leanings makes them inclined to make errors in interpreting information. And so here we use the terms uncongeniality of information, right? And so what this means is if you are, for example, a liberal politician and you believe in public services and you believe public services are best, if we provide you information that shows that a private provider actually outperforms the public provider, will you get the puzzle or the test correct? And what this shows is that both politicians and members of the public have the same sort of pattern. When the information is uncongenial, so when it challenges their partisan priors, they tend to make lots of mistakes. Politicians get it right about 57% of the time. Members of the public get it right even less, about 30% of the time. When the information fits with their partisan priors, so for example, going back to my example, if a liberal politician is told that public services really do perform best, they're going to get that puzzle right about 9 times out of 10. So the error rate really declines. And so the point is, our processing of the numbers itself get sort of screwed up by our ideological priors. We simply will make basic errors when it comes to interpreting and processing the information. So Julian and I also wanted to take this a step further to see if we could debias in some way the ways in which people made these errors. And so we added another wrinkle to the experiment where we asked people to justify their decisions. And so this is sort of a standard debiasing technique that's sometimes used in behavioral science. The idea is that if you have to write down your rationale for decision making, you will sort of think more slowly, you will sort of not use your biases quite so much. In defending your positions, you will end up taking a more careful, evidence-based approach. And we found this worked for the public. So the public tended to make less errors in interpreting the information when we asked them to also justify their solutions. It had the opposite effect for politicians. Politicians became more likely to be influenced by their prior beliefs when we asked them to justify their evaluations. We were sort of puzzled by this and did some additional digging into data to try and figure it out. As best as we can tell, our interpretation is that politicians are sort of skilled, motivated reasoners. They spend a lot of their time justifying their evaluations, justifying their decisions. And so if you ask them to defend their positions, they're really well able to do it. And in fact, they end up convincing themselves along the way. We compared more experienced politicians with less experienced politicians and found that the more experienced the politician, the more likely they were to double down on making errors if they were asked to justify their evaluations. Another important factor that influences our judgment are the sources of information that we have. So we get information about government performance, maybe not specific performance metrics, but government performance generally from all sorts of sources. And those sources can influence how we interpret the information. And in one super simple way, this matters in terms of the credibility of the information. So Greg Van Ryzen has done a couple of experiments here where he's asked people how credible performance data is and how believable levels of performance are when they come from different sources. And basically, the big finding here is that when government reports upon itself, it's not credible if the performance level is really high. People are more likely to believe high levels of government performance if the evidence comes from third party. And so in this case, there's comparison of how credible is information if it's reported by a national government versus if the UN reports the same information about those governments, but it's not coming from the national government itself. The final section I want to talk about now is some contemplation of how we can use some of these insights to actually improve the quality of government. One sort of big takeaway point, I think, from this area of study is the strong potential for individual error and cognitive biases when we make decisions. And one potential solution to that, and there's some evidence that this actually works to check biases, is to have what I refer to as learning forums, but essentially group engagement of discussion about performance, where people engage in some consideration of what the performance data means. I think this is helpful for other reasons. And so some of my other research that's not experimental looks at the US federal government level, if people are more likely to use performance data, if they're also part of things like quarterly performance reviews, and perhaps not surprisingly, they tend to be. But having some routines of data use where you're talking with peers about performance does seem to check some of these biases. But partly it also depends on how these routines are structured. So for example, one experiment by Simon Calmer-Anderson found that if you ask people to imagine that they're writing to a political principle versus a peer, they tend to write more defensively. They tend to not acknowledge errors in performance. Whereas if they're writing for a peer group, they tend to be more forthcoming about potential problems with performance. One insight from negativity bias as a form of bias is that governments might do well to really pay attention to identifying risk and potential areas of failure in these learning forums. So rather than trying to maximize to excellent performance everywhere, to instead target areas of below average performance and fix those. And we also have some empirical evidence that if you give managers more autonomy to make decisions, the sort of new public management logic for running public organizations, they are also more likely to run an organization where they're using performance data on a regular basis. And again, this comes from a field experiment study in Denmark, where we worked with the Danish National Department of Education. They gave varying degrees of autonomy to school principals when they were hiring new staff. And we were curious if those grants of autonomy would also then make people more likely to use performance data. The logic is pretty simple. If I have no autonomy and no discretion, there's really very little incentive for me to actually seek out and use performance data, because it's not going to affect the decisions that I make. I simply don't have discretion to use that information. And so what we found in our study is that when school principals got more autonomy, they tended to be more likely to go to those websites that we set up and download performance data at a later point in time. And so there's evidence of sort of a causal effect there. So there's an argument then for trying to provide more autonomy to managers if you want them to use performance data, and also to sort of encourage them to think about changes in terms of experiments where they're encouraged to maybe sometimes try something new and fail, as long as they're using the data to make judgments. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm more or less on time. And I look forward to the questions or comments you have about this topic or other topics.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Moynihan. We can do this one of two ways. This is a larger group than the last one. So I perhaps would propose for individuals to type their questions and comments in the chat box, and then Justin can help facilitate. Or if you'd like to have folks raise their hand and verbally give questions, we can do it that way too. So just whatever your preference is.
I think if people can electronically raise their hands, it's much more likely that I can see them than if they just do this, because there's a lot of people on the screen.
Okay, so yeah, if you want to use the raise hand function in Zoom, if you have a question, and we'll have Dr. Moynihan call on folks, and if you can't see everyone, Justin's here to help facilitate as well.
Stacy.
Hey, good to see you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, John, for your presentation. I'm not sure how to ask it, so I'm just going to get the words out of my head and we'll see. So like listening to you talk, what kept running through my head is, gosh, we still so fetishize numbers as the big T truth. Yet I heard, if I heard you correctly, some of those numbers need context. So like, where do you think that disconnect comes from? And then part B is like, how do we as scholars and kind of practitioners and doing the work you're doing, make that connection in as a theoretical enterprise and then as a practical enterprise?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I think one way of thinking about this is that, as with the history of public administration more generally, we're in this sort of very reactive mode where we're responding to things that governments have done. And the premise of those government reforms, like the Government Performance and Results Act or specific reforms in education, is that these numbers are good and that they provide an accurate and important account of how the world works, that practitioners and policymakers should use in the real world. And so I think you should interpret what we're doing as trying to maybe complexify that assumption a little bit by talking about, in practice, we're maybe as human beings not designed to be natural number processors, but instead we're going to be exposed to these types of biases, and they're sort of inevitable in the decisions that we make. I do think in terms, so there's like people are in the Herbert Simon approach, like goal-oriented. They want to sort of do the right thing at some level, but they're also limited in how they use information. And I think the sort of bigger difference from a Simonian perspective and what we're bringing to the table is that in Simon's perspective, people use heuristics as shortcuts to make decisions, and generally heuristics work pretty well. And we're sort of articulating situations where those heuristics might lead to some sort of cognitive error. The second thing is the way in which we use qualitative data to make inferences or decisions. And one of the points is about, obviously it's very hard to interpret numbers without that broader context. And we're just not really wired to do that. We need to have the narratives and the context to really make sense of and be compelled or be emotionally aroused by the numbers themselves. And so I think part of the broader lesson is then also you can't really expect context-free numerical representations to change people's behavior. And as much as you push it, to the degree that they're using that information, they will make some sort of cognitive errors along the way.
Really interesting. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Anyone else? This is a big group. Don't be shy.
Free copy of the book for the first person who asks the question.
I was going to say, Deb, if people didn't know, I see another hand. I was like, I've got more questions for Don, but I see someone's hand.
Jared?
Hello, Dr. Moynihan. Interesting presentation. The main thing that I kept thinking about during your presentation was that although it seems like the presentation of data is important and understandably important, I think it doesn't get to the biggest problem with performance data, which is the validity of the measurements. Doesn't it seem like, and maybe I'm way off field here, but it seems like if we have very valid measures of performance, that the measurements will speak for itself and overcome a lot of these biases.
Yeah, so I think there's, if you think about this as essentially a 30 or so year movement from the early 1990s, you could think broader than that. I mean, you see from the progressive era, city government officials using some of this performance data. But if we take like the Government Performance and Results Act as the starting point of the modern age of performance information use, you see that complaint a lot in the first 10 or 15 years in the aftermath of the passage of the act, where legislators are saying, we don't really trust the data, or the quality of the data is not strong enough. And I think at some point you start to doubt the validity of that claim because the numbers.
Can I interrupt real quick? Because when you say that the legislators didn't trust the data, did they not trust how the data was collected? Did they not trust the sample, or did they not trust the validity of the measurement?
I think it could be all of those things, but I think the fundamental challenge for more complex programs is, and I don't know if you think of this as a validity issue, but whether the number actually represents the thing that they care about, right? And part of the problem with any moderately complex program is that there's probably more ways to measure different values than it's possible for human beings to really pay attention to. And so there's another book I worked on with the World Bank a couple of years ago where we looked at case studies of different countries and the evolution of their performance systems over time, because people sort of hadn't really done that. They hadn't sort of tracked across multiple waves of reform what had happened. And you saw these sort of strikingly similar characteristics where a reform would be implemented. There's lots of measurement of performance. And every year, there's more and more performance data that's being measured because members of the legislature or the central budget office will tell agencies, oh, you're not capturing this variable that we consider to be important, therefore you need to add more information. And then at some point, they told agencies to start measuring less things and fewer measures because they started saying, we can't deal with this 500 pages of indicators, no human being can process this. With the Government Performance and Modernization Act, they sort of dealt with this problem by telling agencies, you can measure as much as you want, but we want you to focus on something like 5 to 8 key high priority goals that you're going to pay attention to in the short term. So I think there is like always going to be validity problems with performance data. But at some point, there's the sort of Rumsfeld quote that you sort of go to war with the army that you have rather than the resources that you would ideally want. And another thing that's true is that we've never had a time in the history of the world where there's been as much performance data about every aspect of public sector performance. And at some point, people are going to start using the data or they're not. I think it's a really fundamental, and this is something I'll just conclude with this point. It is a fundamental issue, this question of credibility and trust and ways in which you can sort of increase that. And so we talked a little bit about sourcing. There's another experiment that I didn't talk about where we talked about how your partisan lens affected which sources you found to be more credible. So for example, we found if data came from someone who's a member of a union, liberal politicians would find that data to be trustworthy, conservative politicians would find it to be less trustworthy. And so the question of validity is also tied up into a whole bunch of other things that politicians bring to the table when they look at the numbers. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and raise my hand. So I want to, most of our current audience was not in your last session with the PhD students, but I want to kind of draw a connection between the two in my question. And, I think it's interesting how we saw in the last administration, it seems at times kind of a blurring between politics and the bureaucracy. And I think we've seen more and more, even within the bureaucracy, more and more that people just kind of aren't interested in fact-based performance or research or that sort of thing. So how do you, in one sense, you're sort of preaching to the choir here because you're talking to a bunch of academics who value performance data and evidence-based research and policymaking, but how do you reconcile this, what I kind of view as a blurring of the lines between, bureaucrats and politicians and this struggle to listen to science and evidence and data?
Sorry. So that's a big and important question. So something we talked about in the last session is that the Evidence-Based Policy Making Act was a bipartisan legislation. And I think there are bipartisan reasons why conservatives will want to see that act followed in a period where you have a Democratic president. And obviously the dynamics are different if you have a Republican president. But there is some bipartisan support for the notion of evidence, at least, Now, I think there was a few years ago, maybe it was like 2016, where APAM had a conference theme where the conference theme was sort of the golden age of evidence-based policymaking, and which swiftly became like a punchline because it just felt so at odds with the actual practices of policymaking. With that said, I think if you are cautiously optimistic about the role of evidence in government, which I've become more optimistic over time, you think about this as something that's hardwired into government and the bureaucracy, and has become more so over time and gradually changes at these lower levels, the culture of government. One thing I feel fairly confident about is that the best and most likely audience for performance data is not members of the legislature, is mostly not members of the public unless they're in a situation where they have choice and decisions that are related to performance, like where they put their kids in school or which hospital they choose to have a surgery. It's mostly not political appointees, except in situations where data is really crucial to a policy issue. It's mostly going to be public managers. And at that level, their work environment looks incredibly different from where it did in 1993, right? Every year now, they have to develop strategic goals, they have to provide performance reports, they have to meet 4 times a year on key performance goals, they have to develop a learning agenda to identify evaluation opportunities for their programs. At some basic level, the fundamental language that they're talking is quite different from what it was in the past. And they might be operating in a broader environment where their political principles are paying less attention to this stuff or more attention to this stuff, but they can't really make that hardwired nature of the performance focus go away. Because it's embedded in statute. And I think one interesting thing at the end of the Trump administration, the OMB head at the time, Russ Vought, tried to basically revise Circular A11, which is very inside DC speak for the budget guidance that is about 1,000 pages, gets sent out to federal agencies, but includes a chapter about performance reporting. And Vought basically said, you guys just follow the statute, but you no longer have to report this data to OMB, which was a big change from the last, basically since the Government Performance and Results Act was passed. And the Biden administration immediately sort of reversed that. And I sort of take that as that's about as far as you can go to degrade attention to performance issues, which is limited, quickly reversed, and even still, agencies still had to follow the statute when it came to reporting performance data. And so I think there's some calls for optimism there about how this legislation has pushed agencies to pay more attention to performance, even though they'll always use it imperfectly. There'll always be evidence that they don't use it in decisions where they should, or that their political principles don't pay a ton of attention to it. Okay, so I'm gonna mispronounce this, but Youngwon?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Changwon. Thank you for your presentation, Don. And my question is more or less broad in terms of we are the social science who tries to produce generalizable theory, but I believe also that context matters all the time. So in that sense, and given the diversity of the context and the complexity of each situation, so to what extent do you think we can produce generalizable findings, or even it is possible or meaningful to do so?
So I'll give a really specific answer to that question, and maybe more specific than it deserves, which is that I think that this particular topic that I presented about today is in some ways a model for good social science research across settings. So a lot of the experiments I talked about, some come from England, some come from the US, some come from Denmark, some come from Italy, some come from the Netherlands. And you see a consistency of findings across these settings where Danes actually make interpretations of performance data that look a lot like Americans. Now, the world is a much bigger place than those places, but it's not, the body of evidence is not solely tied to just US studies in this particular case. Like it's one of the more international bodies of public administration research that I think is genuinely cumulative and has some reasonable claims to be getting at what are really basic fundamental processes of processing information. And I sort of interpret our project here as being somewhere in between psychologists who are looking at this problem from an even more basic process of how humans make decisions, where we're adding the context of the public sector and adding some reasonably realistic details like public sector performance data, politicians and their characteristics, and even more applied situations where people are studying a particular reform or a particular agenda to use performance data. And for the early part of my career, I was in that much more applied situation where I was studying, what the federal government was doing, and I do some of that still. But I see this as a little bit more of a step back from that, to be slightly less applied and slightly more generalizable across different settings. David.
Good afternoon. Good to see you again. My question, anytime we talk about evidence-based decision-making, I always come at it from a kind of administrative point of view and the idea of administrative neutrality. And if we're going to talk about adding context to performance data and the professional norms of trying to stay neutral in policymaking or politically charged discussions, just how those two concepts interplay. So I guess my more specific question is, as an administrator, is the only burden to present information and allow the elected officials to provide the necessary context, or should the administrators also be providing context when they provide the data? And beyond that, what happens when the data happens to support one side or the other? Are they showing a lack of neutrality when they're reporting data that's clearly favoring one argument over the other? Or is there an obligation to try to find a third way to contribute to the discussion without appearing to be biased in some sense? So that's kind of a dump of thoughts about administrative neutrality and evidence-based decision-making, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
So there's one thing I would add to the presentation that I didn't add that's relevant to your point here, which is that when you talk about priming people and values in how to use information, one thing I didn't talk about is how we prime administrators. And I think because they are the actors who are most likely to use information, we should think about this. They're also the actors that political principles have the most control over. And so I think you can prime administrators to really think about using data in a way that's consistent with logics of honesty, impartiality, and political neutrality as part of their job, in a way that you can't do that with elected officials for very obvious reasons. And so, if I was thinking about training of public officials, I would sort of build that into the process of any performance training as some sort of a solution. Sorry. Sarah.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very interesting. Thinking back to sort of the discussion that Stacy was bringing, I'm sorry that the conversation moved a little bit since then. I wanted to hear your thoughts on sort of the converse of what you're arguing. So the people that argue that big data is the way of the future, the data should be driving the explanation. We don't need the context. We just need the data, and the data will tell us what to do. We throw into a machine learning algorithm and it pops out some answers, and that's the way forward. So what do you say to those individuals?
So, I mean, I think that the contexts in which we use data in the way that you described, so think about something like using value-added data in teaching to provide rewards. I remain sort of deeply skeptical about structuring data use in a way that doesn't generate some sorts of risks, different risks from the ones I've articulated in terms of outcomes. And so in particular, you know, the classic Campbell's Law account of data, which is that, you know, once we put a ton of weight on some social measure of performance, people will find ways to erode the value of that indicator. And so then people will obviously do things like teach to test or cheat or so on in ways that really make that indicator problematic. So I think mostly we see policymakers not using this sort of automated algorithmic decision-making modes. There's some cases where, for example, I think with performance-based funding for colleges at the state level, some small percentage of funding might be tied to some particular metrics. And, you know, when Wisconsin adopted this, I went to the governor's office and I said, here are the potential things that could go wrong. Here are reasons you probably don't want to reduce your own discretion in these types of decisions. But there are cases where sometimes policymakers will want to do that. The other sort of concern I have is the opaque nature of more algorithmic decisions. If people don't actually understand what goes into the decisions, or in particular, if they don't understand how much weighting makes a difference. And so there's some work from the UK that sort of illustrated if you throw a batch of performance indicators together, the outcomes can really look quite different depending on the weighting you attach to each particular one in a way that's not going to be obvious to the users of that index, right? And so you would sort of think, oh, well, we've accumulated all these performance indicators that tells us about true performance, but if the indicator is not robust enough to sort of sensitivity tests where you reweight things, then you question whether it's some Platonic ideal of performance you're actually creating, or you're just constructing a different approach to performance. So yeah, I'm generally pretty skeptical that we're going to move towards some of those types of decision-making models that you articulate for some pretty good reasons.
Thank you. I appreciate your response.
Thank you, Sarah.
And with that, we've actually gone a little bit past our time here. So please help me in thanking our guest speaker for a really, really riveting lecture and great Q&A afterwards. So Dr. Moynihan, thank you so much for joining us. We're really pleased with what you've shared with us here today. Just as a little bit of housekeeping, if anyone on here is attending the PARC conference, or even if you're not attending the PARC conference, you can right now from 4 to 5 p.m. hop over to another Zoom link for a pre-conference social. So we hope to see you all over there and certainly at the conference tomorrow. But I will give Dr. Moynihan the final word if you have anything that you'd like to say in leaving us today.
It's just really nice to see everyone in the current moment. I wish we could all be there in person, but it's nice to see faces and hear your questions at this moment. So I hope I'll see some of you tomorrow.
Yes, you definitely will. And Dr. Moynihan will be our keynote for the conference tomorrow. And hopefully at some point we will get you down in the midst of the palm trees down here. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a lovely afternoon and evening. Thank you.